What's up, guys? Welcome back to Deck Tech for Decks. I'm your host, Caleb. If you want to support me directly, you can now follow me on Patreon. Not only is it the best way to support the channel, additionally, you'll get more say in what deck techs I cover. You can also use that TCGplayer link in the description down below, or as always, just liking, commenting, subscribing will do the trick. Now, let's get into today's deck tech with the Cyber Controller. And honestly, this guy is the best, if not one of the best mill commanders, because half the time, if I'm playing against a mill deck, I don't even care. I'm going to get access to my creatures. I have a lot of recursion usually in my decks, so I kind of want to be milled. That way I can recur all of my pieces. But this guy makes it to where all of the creatures you mill will end up on your side of the battlefield, basically screwing over all of your opponent's reanimator strategies. So now it's not very good to get milled by this guy, and he mills everybody. So the odds that you cast this guy for 3 and end up with just like 6 creatures on your battlefield is very likely. This makes it to where you can use combat damage as a viable way to kill people in a mill strategy. Additionally, it's kind of broken. We can use Clark Clan Ironworks, get a bunch of our opponent's creatures, sack all of them, and then cast our commander again to mill them for more, getting more creatures. Another thing we're going to do with this deck is we're going to have a lot of things that reanimate stuff from graveyards. So whenever we mill our opponents to oblivion, if we mill something powerful, we can easily sacrifice it for value and then reanimate it on our side of the battlefield, basically flipping it face up, and now we have some broken creatures. So if that sounds like a deck tech you want to get into, let's get into it. Let's kick it off by talking about how we can generate infinite mana and mill our opponents to death. Now, this should be fine in your casual pods because this does take quite a lot of setup. Let's start it off by getting a Hullbreaker Horror on the battlefield. Now, there are ways to animate this and throw it into our graveyard to make it a little bit easier, and honestly, this guy's broken in his own right. Not only can he bounce your opponent's permanents, he can bounce your permanents, and he can interact with the stack, bouncing your opponent's spells back to their hand. But how are we going to generate infinite mana with this guy? Well, you're going to need a mana rock that's mana neutral, such as Basalt Monolith, and then a mana rock that's mana positive, like Soul Ring. Now we can go ahead and bounce these two back and forth, making sure we're netting 1 mana while we're doing it, and that will generate infinite colorless mana. Now, again, you will need at least 2 blue pips and a black pip to cast your commander. That way you can utilize that infinite mana, but then once that happens, you can mill your opponents to oblivion and end up with all of their creatures on your side of the battlefield. Another way we can utilize this strategy is using Vidalcan Archmage to draw our entire deck, because again, we will be casting those artifacts again and again and again, and we can also use Urza Lord High Artificer to cast our entire deck. On top of that, Urza is just going to be amazing in the deck because now we can tap all of those Cybermen for mana, which again, you end up with a lot of Cybermen very fast. I was very surprised with this deck. Moving on to Recursion, we have Breach the Multiverse. Now remember, you can always just sacrifice the creatures that you already have of your opponents, putting them back into your opponent's graveyard and reanimate them with this. So sometimes you'll know exactly what you're getting from Breach the Multiverse, but honestly, it's still amazing just to outright cast. You're going to get something good out of somebody. Then we are running all 3 enchantments that can animate creatures from graveyards. Notably, this is from a graveyard, so all of these can go ahead and target any creature out of any graveyard, and that's why I am including them in this deck. Again, your opponent shouldn't have very many creatures in their graveyard because they're on your side of the battlefield, but again, you sacrifice them, they go back to their opponent's graveyard, and then you reanimate them. It's kind of a complicated way to make sure those Cybermen can flip around, you know? This Scarab God, not only is this a big mana deck, so we can sink a lot of mana into that ability, additionally, it's going to fit perfectly with the theme of reanimating all of our opponent's stuff, and it can also work on our stuff. Reanimate's just going to be super solid. Again, this is going to be from any graveyard. I'm excited to test out Lich Knight's Conquest here, since we do have a lot of artifacts to sacrifice, and then we can bring our bombs back from our graveyard to the battlefield. Imri's also going to be solid with how much mana rocks we are running. If we start losing our mana rocks, we can kind of get blown out, so Imri's going to be solid. That way we can cast all of our mana rocks from our graveyard. We do run Unwinding Clock, and that can cause some insane synergy, so let's go over them. First off, we do have Shimmer Dragon. So in a scenario where we have Unwinding Clock and Shimmer Dragon on the battlefield, and a bunch of those Cybermen, we can just start tapping them to draw a ton of cards. Basalt Monolith will untap itself, that goes without saying, and then we have Urza Lord High Artificer. This one's insane with Unwinding Clock. As long as we have 5 Cybermen, that will activate his ability, so on each of our opponent's turns, we're going to be able to get an Urza activation, which can be extremely powerful. powerful. Then we have the One Ring. Notably, the damage happens on your upkeep, so if we can tap this on our opponent's turns, yes, it adds the burden counters, but we don't take the damage until our upkeep. So this will draw us into a ton of cards while mitigating a ton of the damage that is supposed to be the downside of this card. Moving on to the core of the deck, we are running Bruvac. That way we mill double, and that's going to get us a lot more Cyberman, which is what we need. Astronaut's Altar and Krark Clan Ironworks are kind of an infinite money glitch with our commander, right? Let's say we cast him for, I don't know, 5 and we get 6 Cyberman. Then we can sacrifice those 6 Cyberman for 12 mana, sacrifice our commander, and cast him again from the command zone. Now, we do need the colored mana for this, but every time we do this process, we should get an insane amount of additional Cyberman while also milling our opponents to an oblivion. Clock of Omens can be solid. We have a lot of mana rocks in here that tap for 3 mana, so tapping 2 Cyberman to add an additional 3 mana to our mana pool can result in some near infinite, if not infinite scenarios, right? If we have a Gilded Lotus on the battlefield and a KCI, we can generate the mana we need for our commander while also sacrificing all of those Cybermen. So I'm pretty sure that goes infinite and you just mill out everybody there on the spot, because you're constantly getting more untapped Cyberman to then untap the Gilded Lotus. That way we always have the colored mana to cast our commander. I do say near infinite because you don't know that you get enough creatures to generate enough mana to cast your commander, and then additionally your commander tax keeps going up while you do this. But like I said, near infinite is probably enough, and this card is going to be insane in the deck. Manifold Key, just 1 mana to untap something to add 3 more mana is going to be busted. Also, the One Ring can be pretty good with this. Crystal Shard is going to be solid. We can bounce our opponent's stuff in a pinch, but 9 times out of 10, we're just bouncing our commander back to our hand. That way we can recast him. Cybermen Squadron, this is going to be one of our game enders. It's going to be really solid, giving all of those creatures Myriad, and that's going to be really hard for our opponents to stop. Entomb, 9 times out of 10, we're probably just shoving Hullbreaker Horror in our graveyard. That way we can reanimate him. Mnemonic Betrayal is going to be insane because, again, we have access to a ton of mana, and now we have access to all of the cards we've made our opponents mill. This can cause a very explosive turn. Sir Conrad, yes, our opponent's creatures do end up on our side of the battlefield, but they still do hit their graveyard first. So Sir Conrad triggers are going to be brutal in this deck. Tezzeret the Seeker is going to be solid to untap our mana rocks. He can search up our infinite combos. Additionally, if we do get to that ultimate, which is not hard to get and a lot of people overlook, it's going to turn all of our Cybermen into 6/6s, which can definitely be a game ender right there. Remember, I say 6/6s because our commander does give all Cybermen +1. I thought Thieving Amalgam here is pretty cheeky, right? Because we are stealing all of our opponent's creatures. Even though they are Cybermen, they're still our opponent's creatures. So whenever they die, they will still take that 2 life. We'll gain the 2 life. And then on top of that, manifesting more cards from them is going to be solid. That's just going to give us more bodies on the board. And Manifest is a little bit different than the Cyberman. We can actually flip the manifested cards face up as long as it's a creature and we pay its mana cost. Torment of Hailfire. Sometimes you just generate enough mana and you've got enough to kill everybody, so Torment of Hailfire is going to be a solid option here as a game ender, or maybe just to slow an opponent down, maybe put somebody's life total in check. It's going to be an amazing card in this deck. Moving on, let's cover the ramp cards we haven't already covered. We have Cryptghast and Nirkana Revenant. These are going to be solid cards to just double up on all of that black mana. Thran Dynamo and Hedron Archive are going to be solid as well, just catapulting us ahead of our opponents, giving us access to a ton of mana. Gilded Lotus, I like this because, again, taps for 3 of that colored mana, so that can give us access to our commander's colors if we have ways to untap it, like Unwinding Clock or Manifold Key. Then we have your generic stuff with Sky Diamond, Charcoal Diamond, Mind Stone. We also run Talisman of Dominance, Demir Signet, Fellowar Stone, Arcane Signet, and Wayfarer's Bauble. Just some really good early game ramp that's going to make sure we're able to cast our spells. Dark Ritual, another card that can just put a ton of mana into our commander. Honestly, guys, if you cast this for 3, you're going to end up with like 6 Cybermen. It's honestly insane, especially judging on what decks you're playing against. Now, obviously, if you're not playing against creature-based decks, you might get screwed a little bit, but 9 times out of 10, we're playing casual. People love their creatures. Expedition Map is going to be very crucial to get us into our Orborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth, or our Cabal Coffers. I think you guys know these 2 together can generate an insane amount of mana. Moving on to some of the card advantage, we have Kindred Discovery. I love this because you can just cast cast your commander and then draw a ton of cards. It's honestly crazy flexible in this deck because you can even cast this after you've cast your commander, attack with all the Cybermen, and still draw a ton of cards. Master Thopterus. This is just solid because we are casting a lot of artifacts, and then being able to sacrifice those artifacts to draw cards is going to be solid. Remember, some of this strategy is sacrificing those creatures we get from our opponents and reanimating them on our side of the battlefield, so this guy's going to do that perfectly. Drown in Dreams, Pull from Tomorrow, Silver Scrutiny, and Stroke of Genius are just going to be amazing cards that draw us a ton of cards late game, right? When we can generate a ton of mana but have no cards in hand, these are going to be the perfect cards you want to see. The One Ring, again, this is going to be insane to draw a ton of cards. Cut the Profits is extremely underrated in my opinion. I know you lose a lot of life for this, but you're going to see a ton of cards. Those Cybermen are 3/3, so they're going to be easy to sacrifice, and then, again, draw your cards. Frantic Search and Thirst for Discovery are just going to dig us deep. Now, I know Frantic Search isn't card advantage, but remember, this is a reanimator strategy, so sometimes we end up with bombs in our hand that we can't cast, so it's going to be solid to discard those and get us some useful cards. Additionally, it will untap our land, so we'll take that. Moving on to our interaction, we have our counter spells with an Offer You Can't Refuse, Disruption Protocol, Arcane Denial, and Counterspell. We then play Feed the Swarm to get rid of those pesky enchantments that are hard to get rid of in these colors. Toxic Deluge is going to be an amazing board wipe. Now, I know everything we have is low to the ground, but we're probably only playing this when we have nothing on the battlefield anyway. Swan Song, another solid counterspell, and then we have Their Name is Death, which is going to be a one-sided board wipe since, again, all the creatures we're playing are basically going to be artifacts. That's going to do it for the deck tech, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed. Again, if you want to support this channel, you can now follow me on Patreon, or again, use that TCGplayer link in the description down below. I would now like to thank all my patrons. I couldn't do it without you guys. I appreciate every one of you, and as always, I hope this helped you in your deck building endeavors. I will see you in the next one.